And we are busting indie myths on the daily, weekly, monthly and yearly until the Scot Nats see clearly that we're down with the capital A to the double FG. And this is Busting Indie Myths Part 20. And in this Busting Indie Myths, we're going to address the oft-heard claim that an independent Scotland wouldn't get involved in wars. Now that might seem quite an abstract claim, but you know what? This was a major argument of the Scottish nationalists back in 2014. The idea being that Scotland's alliance with the rest of the United Kingdom means that we're constantly drafted into unwinnable and often apparent unjust conflicts. And back in 2014, the Scottish nationalists and the pro-separatists were making that argument very loudly indeed. It was one of their core arguments: vote for us, get an independent Scotland, and we won't be involved in wars anymore. And they could make it at that time because it was after the Iraq War, and the Iraq War had been opposed by Alex Salmond. Now, the Iraq War was between 2003 and 2011, and the SNP came into power once the Iraq War had started by 2007. And it was a powerful argument at the time, and it went further than just simply a criticism of the Iraq War. It heavily implied that an independent Scotland would not get involved in any wars in the future. Now, to address this matter, let's firstly put aside the idea of whether a separate Scottish armed forces outside of what would presumably be a separate English armed forces. Let's put aside whether that could even work within the British Isles. And let's put aside whether or not a form of British armed forces would actually have to continue very much as normal, because that would be the only way that it could work. Let's put aside those two practical considerations. Okay, put aside those practical considerations and just concentrate on the philosophy and ideology of this particular claim that an independent Scotland would mean that Scotland would not get involved in wars. Well, we can answer that fairly easily, because we can answer it by looking at recent history and today's reality. And the answer is that whether or not Scotland got involved, it will depend, as these things always do, on who is in power, what's their ideology, and where do their sympathies lie on the particular matter at hand. And we know this because if we cast our minds back to Thursday, the 16th of January 2003, now, you might not remember exactly what happened on that day, but I do remember what happened on that day very clearly, because I suppose it's my job to know these things. But back then, on the 16th of January 2003, the Scottish Parliament voted to endorse Tony Blair's strategy for war with Iraq. Okay? At that time, back in 2003, the Scottish Parliament was controlled by the Labour Party. The First Minister was Jack McConnell. And what happened was that they voted to endorse Tony Blair's line that Saddam Hussein must get rid of his, what were then said to be weapons of mass destruction, or face invasion. And the Scottish Parliament voted by 67 votes to 51 votes to endorse Tony Blair's strategy. Now, while the Scottish Parliament didn't have any authority over the matter of the invasion, it nevertheless put it into record that the Scottish Parliament, speaking on behalf of the Scottish people, was for the war in the potential, of war in Iraq at that time, if the condition of Saddam Hussein not getting rid of his weapons of mass destruction was not met. Now, in the fullness of time, of course, Saddam Hussein was not able to get rid of his weapons of mass destruction, just as I am not able to get rid of my fleet of luxury Rolls-Royce cars, or my personal resort in the Bahamas, or my private jet, for the simple reason that I don't have any of those things. But of course, at the end of the day, Saddam Hussein made that argument, was unable to get rid of his weapons of mass destruction, and war ensued. And of course, in the fullness of time, it's been proven that he did not have any weapons of mass destruction. But that doesn't change the point that the Scottish Parliament voted to endorse essentially Tony Blair's strategy for war in Iraq. So we know by looking at history what can happen as a result. Just because you've got an independent Scotland doesn't mean that the people who are actually occupying the position of MPs in the Parliament are somehow all going to be pacifists who are all going to say, oh no, I'm not going to get involved in that. Look at the situation today. The SNP and Greens are very pro getting involved, at least from a distance, in the war in Ukraine. They're absolutely aligned with the UK Conservative government's position on that matter, whatever you may think of the conflict. So right now the SNP Greens are making common cause with the Conservative Party in London on the particular matter of war in the Ukraine. So if we imagine that Scotland was suddenly made independent tomorrow, right now with an SNP Green government, and England was independent with a Tory government, then the two countries would still agree on this matter. And today, within the United Kingdom, if Rishi Sunak, God forbid, declared war on Putin, the SNP and Greens would be right behind him. So what we can say from past history and from the reality right now, and putting aside whether a separate armed forces for Scotland would even be practical, what we can say, what we can accurately deduce from recent history and from the reality right now, is the fact that if Scotland was independent, that would have no bearing in and of itself on the matter of whether Scotland got involved in any external international conflict. What would decide the matter would be, as always, who's in power, what's their ideology, where do their sympathies lie on this particular matter. So it's simply not true to say that an independent Scotland would in and of itself not get involved in international conflict. That's certainly not the experience that we've had if we use the devolved Parliament in Scotland as a guide. Thus endeth Busting Indy Myths Part 20.